I opened my front door to find my parents and my twin brother standing there, looking completely out of place in my penthouse. My mother was clutching her purse like it would save her, my dad had this fake friendly smile plastered on, and my twin? He just stood there, arms crossed, like he didn't even want to be there. The last time I saw these people, I was a homeless teenager they'd kicked out of their house. Now, they were in my house, and I knew right away this wasn't a social call. "Wow," my dad said, looking around like he was in a museum. "You've done well for yourself. Really well." I stood there, trying to figure out if I was angry, amused, or just done. Because trust me, the last thing I expected was for them to ever come crawling back. But let me back up. This isn't just a story about revenge or rags to riches. It's about how I ended up here, staring down the same people who once left me to rot on the street. It all started the day they dumped me. I was 14, standing on the front lawn with my stuff in garbage bags. My twin, Jake, stood by the door with this smug look, like he'd won some kind of competition. My parents didn't even seem upset, they just kept saying, "You brought this on yourself," like I'd committed some unforgivable crime by being a kid who didn't fit into their perfect little family. The truth? Jake was their favorite. Always had been. He was the golden child, the straight-A student, the athlete, the one who could do no wrong. Me? I was the problem. The one who got yelled at for getting a B. The one who got grounded for things Jake would laugh off. I don't even think they liked me. They handed me $50, said I'd figure it out, and shut the door behind me. Just like that, I was on my own. For the first week, I slept in an abandoned car near a strip mall. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I was just a kid with no plan. I used that $50 to buy cheap food from a gas station, and by the end of the week, I was starving and broke. The turning point came when I wandered into a public library, looking for somewhere warm to sit. I overheard a librarian talking to a kid about local shelters, and I worked up the courage to ask for help. She didn't even blink, just handed me a flyer and gave me bus fare to get there. The shelter was a whole new world. There were kids who had been through hell, abuse, addiction, things I couldn't even imagine. I felt like I didn't belong, but at the same time, I had nowhere else to go. They gave me a bed, some clothes, and a hot meal, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was about to fall apart. But life in the shelter wasn't easy. There were fights almost every night, and everyone was desperate. One kid tried to steal the little cash I had left, and I got into my first real fight. I learned quick that you had to keep your head down and watch your back. What kept me going was this one volunteer, Ms. Linda. She was there every weekend, handing out supplies and listening to us like we were real people, not just a bunch of lost causes. One day, she sat me down and asked, "What do you want to do with your life?" I didn't have an answer. I mean, I was 14, living in a shelter. What could I even hope for? But she didn't let it go. She signed me up for this after-school program that taught job skills, and that's where I learned how to fix things, bikes, appliances, anything mechanical. It turned out I had a knack for it. By the time I turned 16, I was juggling school, a part-time job at a garage, and trying to save up for when I'd age out of the shelter. It was exhausting, but it gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time, I started to believe I could actually make something of myself. By the time I was 18, the shelter couldn't keep me anymore. That's the rule, once you're legally an adult, you're out. I had a little saved up from working at the garage, but it wasn't much, barely enough for a room in a rundown shared house. The kind of place where the pipes always leaked, the neighbors were loud at all hours, and you double-locked your door at night. The job at the garage kept me afloat, but it wasn't enough for the life I wanted. I wasn't going to be the guy stuck changing oil for minimum wage forever. I started asking the owner if I could pick up extra shifts or learn more skills. At first, he just brushed me off, said I was too young to take on the bigger jobs. So, I started staying late anyway, watching the older guys work and asking questions until they got tired of me pestering them. One of the mechanics, Tony, eventually gave in. He showed me how to do more complicated repairs, and I picked it up fast. One day, Tony told me, "If you really want to make money, you've got to get certified." That meant paying for classes I couldn't afford, But he was right. So, I started hustling. I took on every side gig I could find, mowing lawns, cleaning gutters, even some sketchy jobs moving packages for cash. I didn't ask questions. I just needed the money. By the time I was 19, I'd saved enough for a few courses at the community college. I went to school during the day, worked at the garage in the evenings, and picked up odd jobs on the weekends. It was brutal, but I was determined. I wasn't just doing it to survive anymore, I wanted more. I wanted to prove to myself, and maybe even to them, that I was worth something. It wasn't long before I started noticing things at the garage. The owner, Greg, was running some shady operations on the side, selling stolen car parts and doing under-the-table repairs for cash. At first, I kept my head down. It wasn't my business. But then Greg started pushing me to help him. "You're part of the team now," he'd say, like I owed him something. One night, he asked me to deliver a trunk full of parts to some guy in an abandoned lot. When I got there, the guy was holding a gun. He didn't point it at me, but he made it clear he wasn't someone you argued with. That was my wake-up call. I went back to the garage, handed Greg my keys, and quit on the spot. That decision left me broke and scrambling for a plan. I spent the next few months doing every legit job I could find: construction, delivery driving, even janitorial work. Then one day, while scrolling through job boards at the library, I saw a post for an apprenticeship at a luxury car dealership. It was a long shot, but I applied anyway. The dealership was in a whole different world. The floors were spotless, the cars cost more than I'd make in a decade, and the customers walked in like they owned the planet. I felt completely out of place during the interview, but I must have said something right because they hired me. The apprenticeship was tough, but it was also the break I needed. I was learning advanced diagnostics and high-end repair techniques. The best part? I was finally making enough to move out of that crappy house. I found a tiny studio apartment, nothing fancy, but it was all mine. As I got better at my job, I started noticing a pattern: the dealership's clients were rich, but clueless about how their cars worked. They'd drop thousands of dollars on repairs without asking questions. That's when it hit me: I could do this myself. If I started my own shop, I could make way more money and call the shots. I spent the next year saving every penny I could. I ate ramen, wore the same clothes until they fell apart, and worked every overtime shift I could get. By the time I was 23, I had just enough to rent a small space and buy some second-hand equipment. That's how my first business started, a tiny garage with a big dream. At first, business was slow. I'd stand outside handing out flyers to anyone who walked by. I offered free diagnostics, undercut the competition, and worked 12-hour days to get my name out there. Slowly but surely, word spread. By the end of the first year, I was barely breaking even, but I was surviving. Then something unexpected happened. A guy came into the shop with a Maserati. He said the dealership had quoted him some insane price for a repair and wanted to know if I could do it cheaper. I'd never worked on a car like that before, but I wasn't about to say no. I spent all night researching, fixed the car, and charged him half of what the dealership wanted. He was thrilled and told all his rich friends about me. Within 6 months, I was getting calls from people all over the city asking if I could fix their luxury cars. I started raising my prices and hiring more mechanics to keep up with demand. By the time I turned 25, my little garage had grown into a full-fledged business. By 25, my garage was turning into something big. I wasn't just fixing cars anymore, I was running a business. It was a whole different kind of stress. I had to deal with payroll, suppliers, permits, and customers who could be difficult, to put it lightly. There were days when I thought about quitting, but every time I looked at what I'd built, I knew I couldn't walk away. The turning point came when a customer named Richard walked in. He was this older guy, real low-key, but you could tell he was loaded. He brought in a Bentley with an electrical issue the dealership couldn't figure out. It was a challenge, but I'd learned enough by then to know I could fix it. It took me 3 days of trial and error, but I got it done. Richard was impressed, not just with the repair, but with how I ran the shop. After chatting for a bit, he asked me a question that changed everything: "Have you ever thought about expanding?" I told him I'd thought about it, but I didn't have the capital to open another location. He nodded and said, "Let me help you with that." I thought he was joking, but 2 days later, he came back with a business proposal. He wanted to invest in my shop and help me grow. At first, I was skeptical. I'd heard enough horror stories about investors taking over businesses and pushing out the original owners. But Richard wasn't like that. He wanted to stay behind the scenes and let me run things my way. The deal was simple: he'd put up the money for a second location, and we'd split the profits until his investment was paid off. After that, it was all mine. It was a huge risk, but I couldn't pass it up. Within 6 months, I opened my second shop in a much better part of town. This one wasn't a small garage, it was a full-service facility with state-of-the-art equipment. I hired a team of skilled mechanics and focused on marketing to high-end clients. The new shop took off faster than I expected. Richard had connections in the luxury car world and started sending me referrals. Soon, I wasn't just fixing cars, I was offering maintenance packages, custom upgrades, and even restorations. The profits were rolling in, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just getting by, I was thriving. But success came with its own problems. My old landlord decided to jack up the rent on my original garage, thinking I could afford it now that I was doing well. I refused to pay the increase, and he gave me an ultimatum: pay up or leave. Instead of giving in, I found a new location and moved everything out within a week. The landlord thought he'd ruined me, but the move actually worked out for the best. The new space was bigger, cheaper, and in a better location. It became my flagship shop, and business doubled within the first year. By the time I hit 30, I owned 3 locations and was starting to get attention from people outside the car repair world. A tech startup reached out to me about partnering on a project to install custom EV charging stations. That deal led to another partnership with a major car manufacturer to test their new electric models. I was working harder than ever, but it was paying off. I bought my first house, a real house, not some shared dump or tiny apartment. It was modest compared to what I could afford, but it was mine. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from Jake. My twin brother. I hadn't heard from him in over a decade. The last time we spoke, he was standing on the porch with our parents, watching as they kicked me out. Now, he was acting like nothing had happened. "Hey, man," he said, like we were old friends. "I heard you're doing well. Thought I'd check in." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to hang up, but curiosity got the better of me. We talked for a while, mostly small talk, but then he dropped the real reason for his call. He was in trouble. Jake had followed the path our parents laid out for him: college, a corporate job, and a picture-perfect life. Or so I thought. Turns out, he'd made some bad financial decisions and was on the verge of losing everything. He wanted to know if I could help. I didn't give him an answer right away. I told him I'd think about it, but the truth was, I didn't know if I wanted to help. This was the same guy who stood by while our parents threw me out like garbage. Now he was coming to me, the problem kid, for a bailout? I didn't hear from him again for a few weeks, but then my parents showed up. That's when it all came full circle. When my parents showed up, I wasn't surprised. Jake had probably run to them after I didn't give him an answer, and now they were here to plead his case. I didn't invite them into my penthouse. Instead, I stood in the doorway, blocking their view inside. "We need to talk," my mother said, in that same cold tone she used the day they kicked me out. "Talk about what?" I asked. "You made it pretty clear you didn't want anything to do with me when I was 14. She sighed, like she was the one being inconvenienced. "That was a long time ago. We all made mistakes. But Jake needs your help." I couldn't help but laugh. "Of course he does. What is it? Money? A job? What's he told you?" My dad, who'd been silent up to that point, finally spoke up. "He's going through a rough patch. We thought, since you're doing so well, you could step in and help your brother." "And where were you when I was going through a rough patch?" I asked, my voice rising. "When I was sleeping in a shelter, working 2 jobs just to survive, and trying to claw my way out of the hole you threw me in?" Did it ever occur to you to check if I was even alive? My mom didn't flinch. We did what we thought was best at the time. You were out of control. Out of control? I snapped. I was a kid struggling in school, and you decided I wasn't worth the effort. Don't pretend this was about what was best for me. It was easier for you to kick me out than to deal with me. They didn't have a response to that, and for a moment, the hallway was dead silent. Finally, my dad said, "Look, we're not here to rehash the past. We're asking you to help your brother. Family takes care of family." That set me off. Family? Now we're family? Where was this family when I needed it? When I had nothing, and you couldn't even be bothered to pick up the phone? Don't come here and lecture me about family just because it's convenient for you now. My mom's face hardened. If you're going to hold a grudge forever, then maybe we were right about you. You haven't changed. No, I said, my voice steady. I have changed. That's why I'm not letting you guilt me into fixing Jake's mess. I closed the door before they could say anything else. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of relief. For years, I'd imagined what I'd say to them if I ever saw them again, and now I'd finally said it. But the encounter left me restless. I couldn't focus on work or anything else for the rest of the week. Part of me felt like I'd done the right thing, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just turned into the very thing I hated about them. A few days later, I got a call from Jake. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "I heard they came to see you," he said. "Yeah," I replied. "Nice of them to send the cavalry." He was quiet for a moment before saying, "I didn't ask them to do that. I told them not to." "Why are you even calling me, Jake? What do you want from me?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I don't know what to do. I screwed up, okay? I made some bad investments, and now I'm drowning. I thought maybe you'd understand what that feels like." That caught me off guard. Jake had always been the golden child, the one who had everything handed to him. Hearing him admit to failure was unexpected. "What exactly do you need?" I asked. "Enough to get out of the hole," he said. "I'm not asking for a handout. I'll pay you back." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to hang up and leave him to deal with his own problems, just like they'd left me to deal with mine. But another part of me couldn't ignore the fact that he was still my brother. "I'll think about it," I said. "But if I do help you, it's on my terms. No games, no guilt trips, and no interference from mom and dad. Got it?" "Got it," he said. I spent the next few days trying to decide what to do. On one hand, I owed him nothing. On the other hand, I wasn't the same kid they abandoned. I'd built something out of nothing, and I didn't want to let bitterness define me. In the end, I agreed to meet him in person. He looked different from how I remembered: tired, defeated, and a little desperate. We sat down at a coffee shop, and he laid out his situation. He'd sunk everything he had into a failed business venture and was facing foreclosure on his house. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. He looked down at his coffee. "Pride, I guess. And I didn't think you'd want to help me." "Fair assumption," I said. "So, what's your plan? Because I'm not just handing you a blank check." Jake nodded. "I've been talking to a financial advisor about restructuring my debt. If I can keep the house, I'll sell it and use the money to start over. I just need enough to bridge the gap." "How much?" $30,000, he said, almost choking on the words. It was a lot, but not enough to ruin me if he didn't pay it back. I made him sign a written agreement before I transferred the money. "I'll pay you back," he promised. "We'll see," I said. Jake took the $30,000, and I didn't hear from him for months. To be honest, I didn't expect to. I'd written the money off as gone the second I hit transfer. It wasn't about the money anyway, it was about putting an end to this chapter of my life. If helping Jake got my parents off my back and let me move on, it was worth it. Or so I thought. Then, one day, I got an email from him. No subject line, just a short message. I sold the house. Can we talk? I ignored it at first. I didn't want to get dragged back into his mess. But a week later, he showed up at one of my shops. My manager called me to let me know a well-dressed guy claiming to be your brother was in the waiting area. When I got there, Jake looked nervous, like he didn't know if I'd even speak to him. I didn't know how else to reach you, he said. You've got my number, I replied, crossing my arms. What do you want? I sold the house, he said again, as if that explained everything. And I've got your money. That threw me. I'd been so sure he'd disappear or come back with some excuse about why he couldn't pay me. Instead, he pulled out a cashier's check and handed it to me. 30,000, plus interest, he said. I figured it was the least I could do. I looked at the check, then back at him. Why are you really here, Jake? This isn't just about paying me back. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. You're right. I came because I owe you more than money. I owe you an apology. I wasn't expecting that. I was a jerk to you, he continued. Back then, I thought I was better than you. I thought Mom and Dad were right to kick you out because it made my life easier. I didn't want to see what they were doing to you because it would have forced me to admit they were wrong. I'm sorry. It was the first time I'd ever heard Jake admit to anything like that. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Why now? I asked. Why not years ago? Because I didn't get it until it happened to me, he said. When I was about to lose everything, I realized how alone I was. No one was there to help me except you. And you didn't have to. You owed me nothing, but you still helped. That's more than I ever did for you, and I regret it. I didn't forgive him on the spot. I wasn't ready for that. But I could tell he was genuine, and that was a start. Things were quiet after that. Jake paid me back, and I didn't hear from him or my parents for over a year. In the meantime, my business kept growing. I opened 2 more locations and started thinking about expanding into another city. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from a lawyer representing my parents. At first, I thought it was some kind of scam, but the lawyer explained they were trying to settle their estate and wanted me involved. They're not dying or anything, he said quickly. They're just reorganizing their assets and want to make sure everything's in order. I told him I wasn't interested and hung up. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few weeks later, I got another call, this time from my dad. We need to talk, he said. It's important. I didn't want to see them, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between their house and my office. They looked older than I remembered, like the years hadn't been kind to them. My mom started talking first, but I cut her off. Before you say anything, let me be clear, I said. I'm not here to fix your problems. If this is about money, the answer is no. It's not about money, my dad said, surprising me. It's about making things right. He went on to explain that they were downsizing and wanted to make amends before they moved. They knew they'd messed up by kicking me out and letting Jake take priority. They said they'd spent years convincing themselves they'd done the right thing, but now they realized how badly they'd hurt me. I sat there, listening, but I didn't say much. I'd imagined this moment for years, but now that it was happening, I didn't feel the closure I thought I would. What do you want from me? I asked finally. Nothing, my mom said. We just wanted to apologize. It sounded genuine, but it wasn't enough. An apology didn't erase what they'd done. It didn't change the years I spent struggling while they pretended I didn't exist. I hear you, I said. But forgiveness isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn. And honestly, I don't know if I can give it to you right now. They looked disappointed, but they didn't argue. They just nodded and left. Over the next few months, I tried to process everything. Jake was trying to rebuild our relationship, and my parents seemed to be making an effort too. I wasn't sure if I could fully trust them, but I was willing to see where things went. Today, at 35, I'm in a completely different place. I own a chain of successful auto shops, a couple of real estate investments, and the penthouse I always dreamed of. I don't owe anyone anything, but I've started letting my family back into my life on my terms. Forgiveness is a slow process, and I'm still working on it. But one thing's for sure, I'll never let anyone make me feel worthless again.